Now, the Preclassic period, 4500 to 1700 BP, is also referred to as the formative period. And again, we do have some trends here. We have steadily increasing population because, again, people are settling down into farming villages. This is the period when ceramics first show up in the archaeological record. We see the formation of regional culture groups, and we're actually going to talk about some of those, and we see increasing social complexity. Now, a really good site to kind of illustrate this increasing social complexity is Paso de la Amada, which is over here in the Pacific coast of Guatemala, right near the Mexican-Guatemala border. And we see that from 3550 to 2850 BP, a trend towards increasing social complexity. We have over 50 residents that have been located. Subsistence-wise, we see gardening, we see foraging, we see a mix of riverine and marine resources. The burials start to indicate a little bit of social differentiation, but not tons. But again, the social complexity has to do with the organization of the community itself, not just the statuses. There's possible that we've identified some residences, which some people have suggested is like a leader. I kind of hesitate to use the word king, but we're going to go with that anyways. And it might have been that this was a place for celebration. There's a lot of evidence of feasting, so we find a lot of pottery types that are specifically like bowls and dishes that would be good for serving different kinds of food. We also find in some of this pottery traces of cacao. So here, down here is actually a cacao bean or cacao pod. That's what it looks like on the tree. Then you harvest the beans here and you can process it. Of course, this is modern chocolate, but you can process it then into chocolate. So we find residue of cacao on some of the pottery that's been found at Paso de la Amada. So some possible evidence of feasting. We know later on cacao and chocolate drinks are actually pretty important in different kinds of ceremonies and rites. And the site, it is the largest site in the area, so some people have suggested that it's like a chief's community. We also find the oldest ball court here. So again, ball court becomes a very, very important game. We're going to talk about that a little bit more too, and it's more than just sport. So anyways, increasing social complexity, Paso de la Amada. Now from 2300 to 1700 BP, we see during this Preclassic period the state development, and we're going to see some very large sites emerge. But we do see kind of a chiefdom culture emerge first, and we're going to talk about that. But from here on out, instead of talking about things by period, we're going to start talking about things by culture. And we're going to start with one of the first kind of well-defined cultures in Mesoamerica, and that's the Olmec. So we see some evidence around 3500 BP. Real concrete evidence of large communities shows up around 3200 BP, and the Olmec lasts until about 2400 BP. Now there's a very large, what's referred to as a sphere of influence. So we find Olmec-style artifacts all the way down into El Salvador, up into central Mexico, which is the Valley of Mexico, and we see Olmec-style things even in some of the Maya areas. So because of this, some people have referred to it as the cultura madre, or the mother culture. So all the way down here in El Salvador, we see what are referred to as La Venta style artifacts. And La Venta is one of the major Olmec sites up here. And we're going to talk about that site, we're going to talk about San Lorenzo, and we're going to talk about Tres Zapote. So there is some evidence that the Olmec influence did go all the way down here. Now there is some evidence against this idea of the Olmec as the mother culture. And it might just be that there was a shared ancient ideology which would explain why we see all these similarities. We have a lot of variation in social complexity. Not everybody's at the level of the Olmec, and in some of its earlier, like Paso de la Amada, they were at a high degree of social complexity long before the Olmec. By 2800 BP, we find earthen structures at Chiapa de Corzo, which if I remember correctly, it's not on this map, is up here in the central Mexico area. And then those predate, that's 2800 BP. We don't see the same type of structure show up in La Venta until 2700 BP. So it's possible that those particular traits were adopted then by the Olmec peoples. And Olmec, by the way, is the name that the Aztec had for the inhabitants of this area along the Gulf of Campeche. So we're not really sure. People kind of moved away from this mother culture idea and are ascribing more towards this shared ancient ideology. We do see some pan-regional themes pop up with the Olmec, though, and one of them being the feathered serpent, which becomes a very important ideology. So here's an example of an Olmec relief of the feathered serpent, and here you can see a man kind of sitting in the body of the feathered serpent, but not in the body, on the body. So the feathered serpent is responsible for bringing rain. So he travels through the sky and he moves through the clouds, and that's what causes the rain to fall. Now caves are linked to this because the feathered serpent lived in caves, so caves themselves became sacred. In Mesoamerica, caves are often found in the mountains, and again, because the feathered serpent lived in those caves, they became sacred. Now the main Olmec sites that have been identified so far are San Lorenzo, and again that's right down here, La Venta, and then Tres Zapote. And you can kind of see these are the periods of their kind of fluorescence, or when they seem to be holding most of their power, and it does kind of occur in an orderly fashion. So when San Lorenzo starts to lose some of its power, La Venta is increasing its power, and when La Venta is losing it, Tres Zapote starts to come into its own. So the peak of San Lorenzo was around 3000 to 2900 BP when it had about 20,000 people. We find waterworks there, so we find ceremonial ponds, drains. We often find offerings left in ponds. Could be water important. Maybe they were going through a drought at some point. Again, they're farmers, so rain and water are always going to be important. But around 2900 BP, we do see a massive depopulation. Not exactly sure why. Now, La Venta, we know some about. We don't know a lot because some of it was destroyed because of oil company workers in this area. But around 2900, it seems to take off. So whether people moved from San Lorenzo up to La Venta is anybody's kind of guess. But we do start to find at this particular site earthen pyramids surrounded by lower earth structures and courtyards. And then again, Tres Zapote is towards the tail end of that. They all seem to be located in areas where they can control a different resource. So with Tres Zapote, we see basalt at Tres Zapote, salt at La Venta, and at San Lorenzo, clay and limestone. All of these important for various different reasons. Olmec architecture, this is the site at La Venta, so you can see a building platform here that can do a couple different things. It can, keep the primary important areas out of the mud when it starts to rain. It can also help to define a sacred space. But we do see these flat-topped pyramids. Could be that there was a structure on top of it, but again, I'm not sure. I'm not an expert on the Olmec, but I'm not sure if they found any post holes or anything up there, but we don't find any burials necessarily underneath the platforms. We do find burials, however, outside of that kind of ceremonial area. So at La Venta we find a carved basalt sarcophagus, and it was found in this particular log tomb. There are 2 infant burials in the tomb and lots of grave goods. Now this kind of implies that we have inherited status here, or ascribed status. So otherwise, why would infants be buried in a rather elaborate tomb? And here's some of the grave goods. Jade becomes a kind of important figure. And you can see the kind of deformed looking heads here that can easily be done by using cradle boards on an infant's head. Some of the middens around the Olmec sites have burnt and broken human bones. So some people have suggested that there was some ritual cannibalism going on. Again, that's just an educated hypothesis. In some of the burials, we do find caches of Bufo marinus, which is a toad. So we find the remains of the little bones. So this is actually really, really super good preservation because those bones don't necessarily preserve well because they're so small. But these are toads that have hallucinogenic properties. So I know toad looking is still an important part of oh, what's the word I'm looking for? Of some healing rites. So it's possible that that has really ancient origins. Some of the other things we find in Olmec burials are beads, shell ornaments, stingray spines. Many grave offerings have a jaguar motif that we're going to talk about